It was a cold, rainy Tuesday morning when I boarded the train. My usual commute was uneventful: pop in some earbuds, scroll through my phone, and zone out for the 45-minute ride. But that day, my phone battery had died, leaving me with nothing to do but sit and listen to the sounds of the train car. I never could have imagined that what I'd overhear would change my life forever. The train was packed, and I managed to find a seat near a pair of women deep in conversation. They were in their late 50s, dressed in casual but tidy clothes, and spoke with an intensity that made it impossible not to eavesdrop. "She never found out, did she?" one of them said, her voice low but urgent. "No, and I don't think she ever will," the other replied. "It's better this way." Imagine what it would do to her if she knew the truth about him. I couldn't help but be intrigued. Their conversation sounded like the plot of a mystery novel. As they continued, snippets of their dialogue painted a picture: a man who had disappeared, a secret involving a child, and a family torn apart by deception. I felt guilty for listening, but something about their words struck a chord with me. The name Henry came up repeatedly, and the way they spoke about him made it clear he was central to the story. My mind immediately went to my own grandfather, Henry, who had died before I was born. My family rarely spoke about him, and when they did, it was with an air of discomfort, as if his memory carried a weight none of them wanted to bear. I brushed off the coincidence at first. Henry was a common name, after all. But as the women continued talking, one detail after another began to match what little I knew about my grandfather: his work as a carpenter, his abrupt disappearance from his hometown in the 1960s, and even the name of the street where he used to live. My heart raced as I realized they might actually be talking about my grandfather. Could this be the reason my family avoided discussing him? The train pulled into the next station, and the women stood to leave. On impulse, I followed them, keeping a careful distance. They entered a small cafe near the station, and I waited outside, debating my next move. Approaching them felt invasive, but the curiosity gnawed at me. After a few minutes, I decided to take a chance. I walked into the cafe, ordered a coffee, and casually approached their table. "Excuse me," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "I couldn't help but overhear part of your conversation on the train. You mentioned someone named Henry. I think he might be my grandfather." Their eyes widened in shock. For a moment, none of us spoke. Finally, the woman who had first mentioned Henry gestured for me to sit. "Your grandfather," she said cautiously. "Are you sure?" I explained what little I knew about him, and their expression softened. They introduced themselves as Margaret and Irene, distant relatives of my grandfather's first wife, someone I hadn't even known existed. What they told me over the next hour shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. Henry had been married before he met my grandmother, something my family had never mentioned. His first wife, Clara, had left him after discovering he'd been involved in an affair. The child they'd spoken about on the train was Henry's firstborn son, a half-uncle I had no idea existed. Margaret and Irene explained that Henry's actions had left a deep scar on Clara's side of the family. After their divorce, Henry had vanished, cutting all ties with his first wife and child. When he met my grandmother, he reinvented himself, erasing his past entirely. I was stunned. My grandfather, who I had always imagined as a quiet, hard-working man, had lived a life full of secrets and betrayals. Margaret and Irene's stories painted a picture of a flawed, deeply human man who had made mistakes but had also been shaped by circumstances I couldn't fully understand. I left the cafe with their contact information and a head full of questions. Over the next few weeks, I pieced together the fragments of my grandfather's life. I spoke to my mother, who confirmed parts of the story but admitted she knew very little herself. It seemed the silence surrounding Henry's past had been deliberate, a way for the family to move on without confronting uncomfortable truths. Eventually, I reached out to Henry's firstborn son, David. It was an awkward conversation at first. How do you tell someone you're their half-relative out of the blue? But David was kind and open. He told me about his life, his memories of Henry, and the impact his father's absence had had on him. Meeting David was surreal. He looked so much like my grandfather in old photos that it felt like I was staring into a mirror of the past. Despite the pain of the revelation, connecting with him brought a sense of closure I didn't know I needed. My discovery reshaped my understanding of family and identity. It showed me that people are rarely as simple as the stories we tell about them. My grandfather was neither a hero nor a villain, just a man who made choices, some of which had lasting consequences. To this day, I think about that train ride and how close I came to missing the conversation that started it all. It taught me that life has a way of revealing its secrets when you least expect it, and that sometimes, the truth is worth chasing, no matter how unsettling it might be. Second story. It started as one of those nights where nothing much was supposed to happen. I had been out for a walk to clear my head after a stressful day at work. The air was crisp, the kind of cool autumn night that carries the faint smell of burning leaves. My small town, tucked into the hills of northern Pennsylvania, was always quiet after dark, with only the occasional car passing by. I had taken this route 100 times before, winding through residential streets lined with neatly trimmed hedges and the occasional dim porch light. That night, though, something compelled me to take a different turn, down a narrow alley I had always ignored. The alley was darker than I expected, with tall wooden fences on either side. I told myself I'd just cut through it to the next street, but halfway down, I noticed something odd, an overgrown yard behind one of the fences, starkly out of place in our otherwise pristine neighborhood. Vines crawled up the fence, and a gnarled tree cast strange shadows in the moonlight. I almost walked past it, but something made me stop. It wasn't just the yard's disarray, it was the faint sound of something metallic clinking. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peered through a gap in the fence. What I saw was bizarre. In the middle of the yard stood a rusted, ancient-looking swing set. A single swing hung from it, creaking softly in the breeze. Near the base of the swing set, I could just make out the shape of a large, weathered trunk. The sound I had heard was coming from that trunk. Its lid was slightly ajar, and it moved ever so slightly as if someone had been trying to open it. I froze. I couldn't see anyone else around, but the eerie scene sent a shiver down my spine. I told myself to turn around and go home, but instead, I found myself walking through the gate, which had been left slightly open. The yard felt even stranger up close. The grass was wild and knee-high in some places, and scattered throughout were objects half buried in the dirt, an old tricycle, a shattered porcelain doll, and what looked like pieces of a birdhouse. It was like walking into a time capsule that had been abandoned for decades. I approached the swing set cautiously, my footsteps muffled by the overgrown grass. The trunk loomed larger as I got closer, its surface covered in peeling black paint. Against my better judgment, I reached out and lifted the lid. Inside were stacks of yellowed papers, photographs, and what looked like a journal. The photos were black and white, showing a smiling family, a man, woman, and 2 children, standing in front of the same swing set that was now rusting before me. The journal was leather-bound and cracked with age. Flipping through its pages, I found myself immersed in the life of a boy named Elliot. He wrote about the backyard, the swing set, and his love for his dog, Ruby. But as the entries progressed, they grew darker. Elliot began mentioning the man in the blue car, who parked on the street outside their house almost every night. Elliot described the man as watching them, sometimes even stepping into the yard late at night. The final entries were fragmented, written in shaky handwriting. He mentioned telling his parents about the man, but they didn't believe him. His last words read, "Ruby is gone. I think he took her. I don't feel safe here anymore." The sound of a twig snapping behind me made me jump. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. My heart was pounding as I stuffed the journal back into the trunk and hurried out of the yard, closing the gate behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled onto something important. Over the next few days, I researched the house and its history. What I found was chilling. The house had belonged to a family in the 1970s, the Thompsons. Their youngest son, Elliot, had gone missing when he was 10 years old. The case was never solved, and the family moved away shortly after his disappearance. For weeks, I debated what to do with what I had found. Part of me wanted to take the journal to the police, but another part feared being dismissed as a meddling amateur. I finally decided to reach out to the local historical society, which had records of the town's older properties and events. With their help, we pieced together more of the story. Multiple witnesses from the 1970s had reported seeing a blue car in the neighborhood around the time of Elliot's disappearance, but no solid leads were ever pursued. The journal, combined with those old reports, painted a picture of a case that had been tragically overlooked. I eventually contacted the Thompsons, who were now living in Florida. Speaking to Elliot's older sister, Margaret, was one of the most emotional conversations I've ever had. She broke down in tears when I described the journal and the photographs. "This is the first time in decades I felt like someone cared enough to try to understand what happened," she told me. The journal and photos were turned over to the authorities, and while the case remains unsolved, the renewed interest brought attention to other cold cases in the area. I'll never forget that backyard or the feeling of uncovering a piece of history that everyone else had forgotten. It's strange how life works sometimes. A simple walk, a twist of curiosity, and suddenly you find yourself unraveling a mystery. I still walk past that house occasionally, now boarded up and awaiting sale. Every time I do, I think of Elliot and the journal that gave his story a voice after so many years of silence. Third story. When my grandfather passed away last summer, it hit our family hard. He had been the anchor for all of us, the kind of man who always had a joke to tell, wisdom to share, and a twinkle in his eye that hinted at a mischievous past. He lived in a small town in Pennsylvania, in the same house he'd owned since the 1960s. It was where we spent countless summers and holidays, where memories of laughter and warmth filled every corner. After the funeral, my dad asked me to help clean out the house. It was a daunting task. My grandfather wasn't a hoarder, but he kept everything. Every letter, every receipt, every souvenir from trips long forgotten. I drove up one Friday evening, expecting a weekend of packing boxes, reminiscing, and maybe a few tears. What I didn't expect was to unravel a side of my grandfather none of us knew existed. The house was as I remembered it, though it felt emptier without him there. My dad had already started sorting through the main areas, so I decided to tackle the attic. It was a treasure trove of old photo albums, vintage clothes, and dusty knickknacks. Among the clutter, I found a locked wooden box shoved into the far corner. It was small, about the size of a showbox, with a brass latch that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Curiosity got the better of me. I brought the box downstairs, and after rummaging through drawers, I found a small key that fit the lock. Inside was a collection of documents and photographs, along with a neatly folded letter addressed to James, my grandfather's first name. The photos were black and white, mostly of my grandfather as a young man. But there was something strange, as many of them included a woman and a little boy I didn't recognize. They weren't my grandmother or my dad. In one photo, the three of them stood in front of a house, smiling as though they were the perfect family. On the back, in faded ink, were the words June 1953. I stared at the photo, confused. My grandparents didn't get married until 1957. Who were these people? The letter provided some answers. It was dated December 1955, written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting, and addressed to the woman in the photos, Margaret. Margaret, I hope this finds you well. I think of you and Bobby often, though I know I have no right to. Leaving was the hardest decision I've ever made, but it was the only way I knew how to give you both a chance at a better life. Please know that I loved you more than words can say. Yours always, James. I sat there, stunned. My grandfather had another family before ours. That night, I barely slept. Questions swirled in my head. Who was Margaret? What happened to her and Bobby? Did my dad know about this? I decided to dig deeper. The next morning, I showed my dad the letter and photos. He was as shocked as I was. He never mentioned anything like this, my dad said, shaking his head. This doesn't make sense. We spent the rest of the day searching the house for more clues. In the bottom drawer of an old dresser, we found another box, this one filled with more letters and a few legal documents. The letters painted a picture of a young man torn between his responsibilities and his dreams. My grandfather had met Margaret shortly after returning from the Korean War. They fell in love, married quickly, and had a son, Bobby. But by 1955, things had taken a turn. According to the letters, Margaret's family didn't approve of my grandfather. They thought he wasn't stable enough to provide for her and Bobby. He was struggling to find steady work and, by his own admission, drinking too much. When Margaret's parents offered to support her and Bobby if my grandfather left, he agreed, believing it was the best thing for them. The legal documents confirmed it, a divorce decree from 1955 and an agreement relinquishing his parental rights. As we pieced together the story, I felt a mix of emotions. Sadness for my grandfather, who must have carried this secret his entire life. Anger that he'd walked away from his first family. And curiosity about what had become of Margaret and Bobby. I couldn't let it go. With my dad's hesitant blessing, I started searching for them. It wasn't easy, more than 6 decades had passed, and records were sparse. But after weeks of digging online and making phone calls, I found an obituary for Margaret from 2010. It mentioned she was survived by her son, Robert. It took another few days to track down Robert, who was now in his 70s and living in a retirement community in Florida. I wrestled with whether to reach out. What if he didn't want to know about us? What if I was opening old wounds? But in the end, my curiosity won out. I wrote him a letter, explaining who I was and what I'd found. A week later, he called me. Talking to Robert was surreal. He didn't know much about my grandfather, Margaret had rarely spoken of him, and Robert had been too young to remember much. But he was open to meeting, so a month later, my dad and I flew to Florida. The meeting was emotional, to say the least. Robert looked so much like my grandfather that it took my breath away. We spent hours sharing stories and photos, filling in the gaps of each other's histories. Robert had grown up believing his father didn't want him. Learning the truth, that my grandfather had made an agonizing decision he thought was best for his family, was both painful and healing. For my dad, discovering he had a half-brother was equally overwhelming. Since then, we've stayed in touch. Robert even came to our family reunion last Thanksgiving, where he was welcomed with open arms. It hasn't been easy processing everything, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to know him and to understand my grandfather in a new light. This journey taught me that people are more complicated than we often realize. My grandfather wasn't perfect, but he was human, doing the best he could in difficult circumstances. And while I wish he'd shared his story with us himself, I'm glad we found it.